Welcome to episode 9. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about career pivots that actually work. Career pivots are hard. Let's just face it. I know I talk about career pivots all the time, but I fully recognize that they're very difficult to do, and most people do them wrong. A lot of people try to take massive leaps. They try to go from corporate to startup founder, from engineering to product management, from finance to artificial intelligence, without really understanding what transfers. And then they wonder why they can't get hired or why the transition feels impossible. And it's tough. It really is. I've placed hundreds of people through career pivots over the past 20 years. And the thing that I've learned is that the pivots that work the best aren't necessarily the most dramatic ones. They're the strategic ones. And today I want to break down some of the career pivots that actually work, the kind of pivots that I've seen succeed over and over again. And I want to share the frameworks for making that happen. So this is about pattern recognition and not necessarily about theory. I'm Ada Offonry, and you're listening to the Adapted Ambitions podcast. So let's dive into some data. In the US, only 29% of professionals who attempted a major career pivot defined as changing both your industry and also function succeeded in the first 2 years. What's really interesting about this is that professionals who make lateral pivots, so that's changing either industry or your job function, had a success rate of about 67%. And that's if you change one or the other, your industry or function, and not necessarily both. In the UK, the average time to successfully pivot careers is 18 to 24 months. And most people tend to underestimate this. They think it's going to take 3 months or 6 months, and it really doesn't. And the pattern that I've seen for pivots that work are when the moves are adjacent moves and not necessarily massive leaps. And so, you're not necessarily going to go from engineering to plastic surgery or law. It makes sense to kind of go from, say, big tech to a hedge fund doing engineering. That's adjacent. So let's break down the types of pivots that actually work and how to make them happen. Pivot example number 1 is the sector example. So, for example, moving from big tech to a hedge fund, a proprietary trading firm. This is one of the most common pivots that I facilitate, where you'll have a big tech engineer or researcher wanting to move into a systematic hedge fund or a quant firm. It works because there are a number of skill sets that transfer. So, for example, if you've worked on low latency systems, you have knowledge and experience of large scale data infrastructure, distributed computing, you've worked on Python or C++, and you have strong object-oriented programming fundamentals, and you enjoy problem solving at scale. If you've built the infrastructure at, say, Google or Amazon or Meta, then you have the kind of skill set that quant firms need. What doesn't necessarily transfer and what you will need to learn is the domain knowledge. So you'd need to understand trading, markets, market microstructure, systematic strategies, etc. Most firms are happy for you to demonstrate a level of interest. So maybe you read the Financial Times, you read Investopedia, and have a passing knowledge and understanding of what these various terms are, and then they're happy to teach you on the job. The other thing that doesn't necessarily transfer and that you need to be aware of is the culture. So hedge funds tend to be, relatively speaking, smaller than, say, big tech firms. So they're more nimble, they're more agile, they move faster, less process driven than big tech. And then the last thing to really think about are the expectations. So, if you're moving from big tech to a hedge fund, the expectation is that you can operate autonomously. You can operate based on incomplete information. You can handle ambiguity. There is no hand-holding, or typically isn't. There is support, but not necessarily hand-holding. You need to be resourceful. So if you want to make this kind of pivot, I would say there are a few things you need to do. You need to double down on your kind of core skill set that I talked about earlier. You need to learn about the domain, read papers on systematic trading, understand what these quant firms actually do. I definitely say you need need to network with the kind of people who've made these sort of moves before, and they'll tell you how they did it, what they had to kind of navigate, what the interview processes look like. So for example, I've placed software engineers from Google, from Microsoft, from Meta and other big tech companies into systematic hedge funds. The thing to note that people are often concerned about is comp. So comp definitely doesn't go down. If anything, comp goes up. So I've placed, senior software engineers from Google into systematic trading funds where their comp has increased by, 30, 40% or even more. The thing to note is that hedge funds tend to reward performance very fast, and they pay at the top of the market because they do want to attract exceptional clients. So if you've got really strong technical fundamentals and you're willing to learn the domain, then a move from big tech to a systematic fund is definitely one for you to consider. Let's talk about a second type of pivot. And this is where you're pivoting in terms of your scope. So an example could be moving from an individual contributor role to a leadership role. This is the pivot that a lot of people want to make at some point in their careers, not for everybody. They want to go from doing the work to actually leading people who are doing the work. But the reality is that this sort of transition is harder than it looks. People tend to feel entitled to this as a promotion based on tenure, but that's not necessarily the case in many companies. So the thing that people get wrong is they think, well, I'm good at my job, so I'll definitely be good at managing people who do my job. And that's not true, because management and leadership is a completely different skill set. Being a great engineer doesn't mean that you'll make a great engineering manager. Being a great researcher doesn't make you a great research lead. What actually transfers, there are a few things that transfer. So one is your technical credibility. So if you have deep expertise in a particular domain, then that will transfer if you're moving from an individual contributor role to a leadership role. Your team will respect this expertise. The second is problem solving. So if you're good at problem solving already, you'll still be solving problems, but this time you'll be doing it through people and not through code necessarily. And then the third thing is communication. You've been explaining complex concepts to stakeholders. So this definitely scales. The skills that you do need to develop in moving from an individual contributor role to a leadership role are, one, people skills. So I say people skills both in terms of you as an individual, self-awareness in understanding how you come across, not how you intend to come across. In addition to people skills, interpersonal skills with others. So, being able to coach people, being able to take and give feedback, conflict resolution, performance management, etc. The other skill set that you need to kind of develop if you're thinking about making this kind of scope pivot is around strategic thinking. So you're not in the weeds anymore. And so you need to be thinking 3, 6, 12 months ahead. And then the last is being able to influence without authority. If you were in the workplace, say 30 or 40 years ago, you could lean into authority as a way to influence people on your team. But in this day and age, in the current workplace, that doesn't necessarily work. And so you have to learn that you can't control everything. You need to be able to learn to persuade people, align with people, negotiate with people, and bring people along in the direction that you'd like them to go along. And sometimes concede, right, on the directions that others kind of suggest if it makes sense to do so. The key thing I'll say, if you're somebody who is looking to make this sort of pivot from individual contributor to leadership, is you need to start without the title. You need to start without the title. You need to identify mentoring opportunities, maybe with some more junior people in your team or in your company, and you need to support them. Think about projects you can run, show that you can lead. The second thing is make sure that when you have your meetings with your manager, you're communicating your ambitions. You need to be explicit about these ambitions to move into leadership roles or to move into management. And you need to have a discussion about what it will take. Make sure that you get a specific criteria of what this is. So a mistake I see people often making is not having any discussion about this and having the assumption that when an opportunity comes up, you'll be tapped on the shoulder. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in many places. It may happen in some, but you need to be your own best advocate. The third thing I'd say is manage your expectations. Just because you want that leadership role doesn't mean it's going to be yours. And also, if you do successfully make the transition into leadership, your first year will typically be very hard. You're going to miss doing some of the work. You're going to realize just how difficult it is to manage people. And that's absolutely normal. The reality check here is that this isn't the kind of pivot for everybody. Know thyself, know if this is something you'd enjoy doing or something you'd hate. And sometimes you might not know unless you try it out. If you love the craft, so you love building, coding, researching, then it probably makes sense to stay as an individual contributor. It makes sense to stay in an IC role. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I know many people who are thriving in their careers because they understand themselves and they have chosen this pathway. If you're somebody who wants to scale your impact, you want to shape strategy, you really enjoy developing people and solving problems through people, then perhaps leadership is the right next move for you. So the third type of pivot that I see, and is quite common in the nature of the work that I do at my boutique recruitment firm, Inference Search, is the role pivot, where people transition from, say, software engineering to quantitative development. This pivot is becoming more and more common. It happens if you have the right technical foundation as well as market knowledge. So, for example, if you have strong programming fundamentals in the languages that the quant firms use, and you're comfortable with large-scale data, and you have a problem-solving mindset. So quant development is all about building tools and infrastructure for researchers and traders. The kind of skill sets that transfer are, being able to program in the kind of specific languages. So C++, Java, Python, Rust. These are core languages that a lot of quant firms use. They're heavily in use for prototyping, data analysis. Python is at least prototyping, data analysis, tooling. Also being able to work with large data sets. Think, large terabytes of data, and then having knowledge of the fundamentals of algorithms as well as data structures. The kind of skill sets that you'll need to build in making the transition from software engineering to quantitative development are the domain knowledge. So you need to now begin to kind of understand what quant researchers do, the kind of tools that they need, the kind of models that they're building, and the impact of those models that they're building. You need to understand financial market basics. So not necessarily enough to be a trader, but you need to understand market microstructure. You need to understand how markets work. You need to be comfortable operating in a fast-paced, high-stakes environment. So a good way to kind of navigate this pivot is you need to build your GitHub portfolio. So you need to create projects that show, for example, high performance code in C++ or Rust, data processing at scale, clean, well-documented work. Quality matters here. Quant firms will look at the quality of your code. The second thing is you need to learn the domain. So read up about systematic trading, read up books about quant trading, learn about market microstructure, alpha generation. You don't have to be an expert, but you need to speak the language and understand the context. I would definitely advocate you building a network with other quantitative developers. So ask them what they look for when they're interviewing candidates. Learn about what their day-to-day looks like. Ask them how they made the transition, if they did make the transition from software engineering as well. And then the last thing I'd say is target firms that value engineering excellence. So a lot of quant firms tend to be engineering first. And so if they're looking for builders, then that means that you can definitely kind of start there. The reality is that, yes, granted, quant development roles are highly competitive. And, even if you have all the stuff that I've mentioned above, these are really competitive roles to get into. But if you do have the strong fundamentals in the languages I've talked about, Python, C++, Rust, and in some cases Java, and you can demonstrate the ability and passion around building high quality systems, you've got at least the foundations of the kind of skill sets that a lot of these companies are looking for. And the good thing is that if you can navigate your way into these kind of roles, then the compensation available is really top tier. We're talking very comfortable 6-figure comp. as an average, and some quant developers earn in the millions as well, depending on your skill set, your experience, and the sector that you operate within. We've looked at 3 different types of pivots over the course of this episode. Let's talk about a framework that works regardless of the type of pivot you're looking to do. So the first step I'd say is to identify what is adjacent. So don't try to necessarily leap from A to Z. Go from A to B and then B to C. You know, if you're in big tech and you want to start a company, don't quit tomorrow. Go work at a startup first, for example, and learn how they operate and then start your own. Step number 2, I'd say figure out what specific skill sets and capabilities transfer and what doesn't. So make a list of these, look at job descriptions, speak to people, be kind of clear about what skills you have that are valuable in the new domain and what skills you actually need to build in order to make the transition. And be honest, don't necessarily overestimate what transfers. The third thing I'd say is you need to build as much evidence as you possibly can before asking for the job. So that might be side projects, courses, writing about the domain, building your GitHub repertoire. Show that you're serious about making this move. Hiring managers don't necessarily want to take a risk on someone who just says they're interested. They want to take a risk on someone who has demonstrable interest in a particular area. I'd say step number 4 is network with others who've made the move, right? So they'll tell you what actually works, what they did. They'll be happy to refer you. They'll tell you what the interview process looks like. They'll tell you what firms are kind of open to non-traditional candidates. So be sure that you're doing that. And finally, be patient, So many successful pivots, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, take 18 months to 24 months. So just understand that it might happen in that time. For some, it might happen much quicker. It might happen in 3 to 6 months. But for many people, it tends to take a bit of time. So don't be in so much of a rush that you end up making bad decisions. So I'm going to leave you with 3 action points. One is, if you're considering a pivot, first thing I'd say is map out an adjacent move. So don't just think about the end state, think about your next logical step. So for example, if you're in big tech and you want to work in AI research, the next step isn't just join OpenAI. Now, it might be for a very small percentage of people. And I think I saw an article that said it's actually harder to get into certain AI companies like 11 Labs than it is to get into Harvard. So the next step might be, you want to get more research experience. You want to publish a paper. You want to contribute to an open source repository or attend a conference like NeurIPS or ICML or ICLR. So get specific about what is adjacent. The second thing I'd say is identify 2 or 3 people who've made the kind of pivot you want to make. Find them on LinkedIn. Go speak to them at a conference or at a networking event for your industry that you attend. Reach out, speak to them, find out how they made the transition, find out what was harder than they expected. Ask them for advice and ask them if they can refer you. And typically people are significantly more willing to help than you realize. And then, finally, I'd say start building evidence this week. So if you want to pivot, from a software engineering role to a quant development role, start your GitHub project today, if not already. Build something in C++ or in Python or in Rust. Write very clean, beautiful code, document it. If you want to pivot into product management, start, contributing to product discussions at your current company. Speak about what you're learning on LinkedIn if you're able to. Write product specs. Show that you can do the work. Don't wait for permission. Start now. So if you're planning a career pivot and you want help in kind of figuring out what's realistic, what skills actually transfer, how do you actually position yourself? How do you network strategically? How do you avoid mistakes that most people make? I work one-on-one with senior people and with technical professionals who are navigating this. I'll help you kind of map out your adjacent move. We'll build evidence and we'll get you ready. So you can learn more about this at Offonry.com. And if you want insights into career pivots, market intelligence, and what's actually working, then you can sign up for my newsletter at Offonry.com. That's it for this episode. Next time, I'm going to be talking about when to negotiate and when to walk away. So this is about offer evaluation, compensation strategy, and how to know when a deal is actually good versus when you're being lowballed. So you don't want to miss it. I'm Offonry, and you've been listening to the Adapted Ambitions podcast. See you next time.